been said that the best thing is never to have been born, but that once we are born, the best thing is to die quickly. Suppose we accept what I think is a plausible view of existence, namely a pessimistic one, according to which existence contains more bad than good. And for the sake of simplicity, we'll also assume that this is true at every stage of life. If we accept pessimism in this sense, it's easy to accept the first part of the statement, that never being born is best. But does it follow from this that once we do exist, that dying quickly is best for the one who dies? Many think not. One possible way to reject the claim about death while accepting the claim about never being born is to argue that there's an important difference between never coming into existence and ceasing to exist. Specifically, one might argue that while never being born is not bad, death, or ceasing to exist, is bad. And hence the issue is often presented in the following way. Is death worse than continued existence? And if death is worse, then promortalism, or the pro-death position, is false. If continued existence is worse, then promortalism is correct. I've argued before, however, that this is not the right comparison, because when we think about what the possibilities are, the choice we face is clearly not one between continued existence and death. In both cases, we die. So the choice is really between prolonging existence and ceasing to exist at some future time, or ceasing to exist now. And once we understand the choice in this way, it seems that the choice is between two evils on the one hand and one evil on the other, assuming at this point that death is an evil. One evil is preferable to two, so earlier death is preferable to later death. And therefore, once we exist, it is best to die quickly. Now, there's at least one possible objection to this, namely that although death is inevitable, there is nevertheless some benefit in delaying death. But I don't see how a pessimist can embrace this claim, or indeed even embrace the claim that death is bad. To see why, we need to say something about what makes death, or ceasing to exist, bad at all. Probably the most common and arguably the most satisfactory explanation for why death can be bad is that it deprives one of good things that one would have experienced had they continued living. And so it's not that there's something intrinsically bad about being dead. The badness of death consists in the loss of a life that would have been good on balance. And so the argument goes, being alive is usually good, death entails the loss of this good, and therefore death is usually bad. However, it's plainly the case that the pessimist cannot appeal to this argument in the same straightforward way, since existence on the pessimistic view is bad on balance for the one who lives that life. And so while it makes sense for an optimist to delay death on the ground that earlier death entails a greater loss of life, for the pessimist, this doesn't provide any reason at all to delay death. Indeed, it is precisely the loss of life that makes death good in this relational sense. Death prevents a life that would have been bad on balance if one had continued living. And so what makes death bad for the optimist is precisely what makes death good for the pessimist. It's also sometimes said that we desire to prolong life. This seems to be a preference that most of us, even many pessimists, have. And so one might argue that delaying death is good inasmuch as it prolongs the satisfaction of this preference. But it seems to me that even if it is the case that we generally do have a desire to continue being alive once we are alive, we will still need to say something about the preferences that one actually has and the preferences that one in some sense should have, or that one would have if one were fully rational and informed. Sometimes this distinction is described in terms of one's actual desires and one's true or ideal desires. I'll take a very simple example of this. Suppose an individual, we'll call them J, has a preference to eat food A over food B. But unbeknownst to J, J is allergic to A, and eating A will cause a highly unpleasant allergic reaction. I think in this case, almost all would agree that it would be a mistake to say that satisfying this preference is good for J. But the point I'm making is that the mere existence of a desire does not automatically imply that it is good for this desire to be satisfied. And for similar reasons, I think we would be mistaken to suppose that one's desire to continue a life that will contain more bad than good is one that will be good to satisfy. I think it's more true to say that this desire is irrational, given what we know, or at any rate think we know, about the quality of existence. But what about the widespread fear of death? Does this provide any sort of reason to reject promortalism? Here I think we need to first of all distinguish fear of dying from fear of death, because no promortalist denies that dying can be bad, and that fear of dying can be rational. When people say they fear death, I think sometimes what they mean is they fear dying, and not ceasing to exist as such. But I suppose the general point to make here is that fear alone is not a reliable index of the badness of an object or state of affairs. After all, there are lots of things that we might fear that really are not bad for us. And incidentally, if we are right to believe that death really isn't bad for the one who dies, then it seems that our fear of death should be dissolved by this fact. So the thought here is that what makes it reasonable to fear something is that the thing we fear is in some sense bad for us. And therefore Epicurus, who of course denied that death is bad, maintained that fear of death is completely unwarranted. But this is not to say necessarily that there are no good reasons for continuing to live. For example, one's death can affect those with whom one is close or connected in some way. And so one might continue living on the ground that one's continued existence will likely benefit others in some way. But moreover, in practice, dying is seldom easy or reliable. And so there is a very real and serious risk involved in attempting to die. As an analogy, a marriage that is hopelessly unhappy is perhaps better never to have started, but once it has started, it can be very complicated and difficult to reverse. And what is true in the case of ending an unhappy marriage is equally so in the case of ending an unhappy life. So even if one accepts promortalism, it is perfectly possible that, all things considered, the continuance of one's life is reasonable, though if promortalism is correct, in itself undesirable.